Okay, here we are. We're good to go. This is the first time I've done a live stream, so this is all new to me. Anyway, can anarchism be considered a single ideology? My hair's all over the place. All right. So what I want to do in this lecture, to begin with, I want to, by way of introduction, consider what we mean by the term ideology. So Andrew Heywood, in his book Political Ideologies, An Introduction, defines an ideology as having three parts, effectively. So part A is any ideology has an analysis of what the world is like and why it is so, why the world is as it is, and especially an explanation of what is causing the problems in the world, usually encompassing a view of human nature. So that's part A, it's got an analysis. Why the world is as it is, usually encompassing a view of human nature. Part B, in Heywood's definition of an ideology, any ideology has a vision of how the world should be. Okay, so part A is how it is, part B is how it should be, a vision that is of a kind of ideal society. And part C, any ideology has a program of how to get from A to B, from where we are to where we want to be, to this ideal society we want to see. So for Heywood, if there's a political worldview that encompasses those three aspects, that can be considered an ideology. So for example, liberalism, it has an analysis, doesn't it, that the world's problems are basically due to, well, to what? Pause the video. What do liberals think the world's problems are caused by? The world's problems are caused by tyrannical rulers, basically, for liberals. They have a shared vision as well. Liberals. The vision is of a free society in which each individual's human rights are respected, and their program of how to get there, again, pause the video, what's the program of how to get to a place where there's too many tyrannical rulers in the world, to a place where everyone's human rights are respected? Their program, the liberals' shared program, is a program of constitutional government where rulers are bound by the rule of law to respect and uphold individual human rights. So there are some differences within liberalism once we start digging down into the details of this program. But what exactly freedom means and how to achieve it. But on these three basic points, all liberals are pretty much agreed, and therefore liberalism can be considered a single ideology. So the question here is, can the same be said for anarchism? Is there enough of a basic agreement on these three aspects, the analysis, the vision, and the program, between the various strands of anarchism, that it can be considered a single ideology? Or is there so much divergence within anarchist thought that to consider it as a single ideology is simply unfeasible? So in this lecture, I will argue that anarchism can be seen as a single ideology because there is broad agreement on these three basic aspects, the analysis, the vision, and the program. At least on a basic level, a broad agreement does exist amongst anarchists on these three parts, I will argue. So, first of all, let's consider the anarchist analysis of society. So, first of all, I'd argue anarchism can be considered a single ideology because all anarchists broadly share the same fundamental analysis of the world, or at least the social world. All broadly agree that the existence of the state, of state power, is the basic cause of most of the world's problems. And they believe this largely due to their shared view of human nature. Anarchism is, like liberalism and socialism, an enlightenment ideology with an optimistic view of human nature as essentially rational. Anarchists also believe, like socialists, that humans are naturally cooperative. Kropotkin, for example, in his classic work Mutual Aid, challenged the prevalent social Darwinism of his age, arguing that the most successful species were those that cooperated and practiced altruism. His work, by the way, found support in the 20th century from the Nobel Prize-winning biologist Lynn Margulis, whose work demonstrated the central role played on a cellular level by symbiosis between different cells. A little bit of fun fact for you there. Anyway, anarchists also largely agree that human nature is to a large extent plastic or flexible. In other words, what we are is as much, if not more, due to the conditions in which we're raised as it is due to any intrinsic nature, nurture over nature, if you will. And whilst there are some differences amongst anarchists on the issue of human nature, Stirner and other individualist anarchists, for example, tend to see humans as more self-interested than do collectivist anarchists. Nevertheless, they generally agree on these three basic aspects of human nature: rational, cooperative, and plastic or flexible. And it's largely because of this view of human nature as rational, cooperative, and flexible that all anarchists are opposed to the state. So first of all, they oppose the state because it's illegitimate. Not only does it have no right to impose itself on free individuals, but it actually damages and corrupts those individuals in the process. If we really are sovereign individuals, as of course liberals argue, then logically there should be no higher power than the individual. Yet the state is a power whose sole purpose is effectively to oppress the individual. Many anarchists, such as Bakunin, believe that only legitimate authority is the one that one submits to voluntarily, and I would argue that this basic idea of voluntarism is the basic unifying key principle of anarchism. So voluntarism we can define as this idea, as expressed by Bakunin, that the only legitimate authority is one which one submits to voluntarily. But the state is not such an authority. We are subject to its laws and regulations, regardless of whether or not we voluntarily accept its authority. So for an anarchist, the very existence of state power completely contradicts the idea of individual freedom. Remember Locke's natural rights: life, liberty, and property. Well, a state can abuse every one of them. It can rob the individual of their property by fining them, of their liberty by imprisoning them, and even their life by executing them. The state is also exploitative. It taxes people against their will. This aspect is particularly emphasized by anarcho-capitalists such as Ayn Rand, but all anarchists agree that states have no right to use force to extract wealth from the people. And the state is destructive. States fight wars against one another and require individuals to kill, fight, and die for them in the process. Max Stirner in The Ego and Its Own is especially scathing about the way in which states will willingly murder millions in order to further their own interests. Emma Goldman believed the state to be best symbolized by, quote, the club, the gun, the handcuff, the prison, emphasizing its repressive aspects. Whilst Proudhon said, to be governed is to be watched over, inspected, spied on, directed, legislated, regimented, closed in, indoctrinated, preached at, a bit like you are being now, controlled, assessed, evaluated, censored, commanded, all by creatures that have neither the right, nor the wisdom, nor the virtue. The state, in other words, is an oppressive instrument, an offense against the sovereign individual who should not have to accept any authority without freely consenting to it. Now, the liberals have an answer to this, don't they? Locke drew up the idea of the social contract, which was the idea that society has freely consented to the existence of the state because they recognize the need for it. Basing his arguments on Hobbes' idea of the state of nature, the idea that without some kind of state authority, humanity would essentially be in a state of permanent war with itself, Locke argued that society had in fact freely consented to a state in order to avoid this sorry outcome. In fact, it's a bit more subtle than that. Locke's view of the state of nature is a little different to Hobbes. He doesn't see it as a war, permanent war of all against all. But he still nevertheless believes that in order for human rights to be consistently upheld, for natural rights, as he calls them, to be consistently upheld, a state would be necessary. The anarchists argue this is nothing more, this idea of a social contract is nothing more than a fairy tale. It never happened. There is no freely consented contract. One does not voluntarily submit to a state. One's either born into it or conquered by it. But either way, one has to submit to it. Indeed, Locke never even claimed that the social contract was a real historical event. It's merely a philosophical justification for the state. But it is one that the anarchists do not accept. William Godwin, who did not call himself an anarchist, but can nevertheless be seen as one of the key proponents of its ideas, argued that Hobbes and Locke had the matter completely on its head. While Hobbes and Locke argued that a state was necessary to restrain humanity's natural selfishness and greed, Godwin argued that it's the state itself that actually breeds greed, exploitation, and oppression. In fact, anarchists argued that the state, in imposing itself on others, damages both those who are subject to its authority and those who are in authority. In other words, state power damages both its victims and its agents. Those subject to its authority are diminished as human beings because their natural capacity to make rational decisions, their innate freedom, is undermined. But those in authority are also damaged by state power because they're corrupted by it. This belief in the corrupting nature of state power, for example, is what underpinned Emma Goldman's critique of women's suffrage, with the women's suffrage movement, While she was opposed, of course, to withholding political rights to women on the basis of their gender, she nevertheless warned that women's suffrage would of itself not liberate women. And in fact, involvement with Parliament would blunt the radicalism of the women's movement and end up with women defending the system rather than fighting it. To be in power, says Heywood, is, quote, to acquire an appetite for prestige, control, and eventually domination. And this is where the third aspect of human nature comes in, its flexibility or plasticity. Anarchists, like socialists, argued that people are largely shaped by their social, political, and economic environment. This means that although people do have the capacity for altruism, they also have the capacity to be corrupted. It's the social environment in which they're raised that largely determines what kind of characteristics are brought out and developed and which are buried and suppressed. So the very existence of a state creates a situation whereby some dominate whilst most are forced to submit. This does not exactly bring out the best in people. It's another quote from Heywood. People who would otherwise be cooperative, sympathetic, and sociable become nothing less than oppressive tyrants when raised up above others by power, privilege, or wealth. So think here about the Stanford prison experiment, where ordinary college students were turned into cruel sadists when they were given the role of prison guard over their fellow students. Anarchists argued that that would be a kind of metaphor for how the whole of society works, where some people are given state power and others are simply subject to it. And those given it become oppressive, cruel, and so on. Those subject to it become submissive, and so on. The second reason anarchists oppose the state is because it's not only illegitimate but unnecessary. And this is what is really unique about anarchism. Lots of people might agree that the state is an instrument of oppression, abuser of freedom, and so on, but might still justify it as a necessary evil. In fact, to some degree, liberals, socialists, and conservatives all do this. None of them think the state is a particularly wonderful thing, but they all believe it to be necessary in some way. For liberals to protect, think for each of them. Why do liberals? Why do socialists? Why do conservatives? In each case, why do they think the state is necessary? So for liberals, they think the state is necessary to protect our freedoms and uphold human rights. For socialists, there's different kinds of socialists. Marxists think a revolutionary state would be necessary in order to crush the resistance of the capitalists following the revolution, crush the counter-revolution. And revisionist socialists think that the state's necessary as a means of redistributing wealth. Conservatives think it's necessary to keep the twisted passions of flawed, sinful humanity in check. But anarchists do not believe the state to be necessary. Again, this stems from their view of human nature. If humans really are rational, then they do not need any external authority to make decisions for them or to organize their activity. Likewise, anarchists believe humans are naturally cooperative, or at least they would be without the oppressive forces of government distorting their nature and fostering greed and selfishness. Again, this all makes society without government not only desirable, which a lot of people might agree it is, but perfectly possible. And again, human nature is flexible, it's plastic. Which characteristics are brought out depends on the social, political, and economic environment. Another quote from Heywood, he says, just as law, government, and the state breed a domination/subordination complex, other institutions nurture respect, cooperation, and spontaneous harmony. He says the anarchist case against authority is simple and clear. Authority is an offense against the principles of freedom and equality. So in addition to this hostility to the state, which is shared by all anarchists, all threads of anarchism also tend to share a deep-seated anti-clericalism, an opposition, that is, to religious authorities. And there are two main reasons for this. Firstly, for anarchists, the demand for unquestioning obedience to God, and often a cruel and arbitrary God at that, is as much an offense against the voluntary principle and against humanity's rational nature as is the demand for unquestioning obedience to the state. It's a denial of humanity's capacity and responsibility to use reason to reach their own judgments on matters. In other words, religious claims to our loyalty and obedience should be rejected on principle. But secondly, religious authorities have also been opposed by anarchists because they've historically often acted as a prop of state power, an attempt to legitimize its unjust authority. As Bakunin put it, a boss in heaven is the best excuse for a boss on earth. Heaven and hell in particular are examples of what Max Stirner termed spooks, conjured up in order to scare people into obeying their rulers and to demand that justice be delayed until the afterlife. History is full of examples of the church using its authority to justify state violence or demonize resistance movements, from the Crusades to the witch hunts, from the church sermons against Irish rebels after the First World War or against Italian communists after the Second World War. It is for this reason that anarchists have often seen the struggle against the state and against the church as one and the same. A popular anarchist slogan in the 19th century was, "No gods, no masters." Proudhon said, "The first duty of man is to continually hunt the idea of God out of his mind and conscience." He said, "God is evil and man is free." Bakunin said, "As long as we have a master in heaven, we will be slaves on earth. If God existed, only in one way could he serve human liberty, by ceasing to exist." Those are both considered part of the spectrum of collectivist anarchists, but also those who are considered more individualist anarchists, like Max Stirner. Max Stirner also opposed the clerics and organized religion. He said that God sinks into dust before man. So there's a high level of agreement amongst anarchists on this basic position of anti-clericalism. And this is, again, largely due to their optimistic view of human nature. Far from being sinners, people are naturally rational and cooperative. And when they are driven to sin, it's largely the church and the state who's doing the driving, rather than any natural tendency in themselves. As Emma Goldman put it, "I do not believe in God because I believe in man." So it's clear, given the clear convergence of views on human nature, on the state, and on religion amongst anarchists of all stripes, anarchism certainly can be considered a single ideology. But this does not mean there are no differences. There are, and they are profound, and these relate to both the anarchist vision of a future society and the anarchist program of how to achieve their goals. So we'll now turn to part B of Heywood's definition of an ideology, their vision of an ideal society. And there's a major difference here, particularly in the attitude to capitalism. What will be the role of, and by capitalism, I really mean a system based on private property, private ownership of the means of production, that is, competition and markets, a market-driven approach to the distribution and production of resources, goods. So one of the major splits in anarchism is on the economy, and it's particularly between those who are termed individualist anarchists on the one hand, who tend to favor individual private ownership, and collectivist anarchists on the other, who, like the Marxists, support the abolition of private property and the collective ownership of land and other resources. Collectivist anarchists, like Marxists, reject capitalism as a system of class exploitation and systematic injustice. In its place, they want an economy based, at least in part, on common ownership of resources. This would allow for resources to be distributed on the basis of need, rather than on the basis of purchasing power. In other words, they sought to replace the market as a tool of economic distribution with a collectively and consciously organized system of production and distribution based on need. Proudhon, for example, argued that, quote, property is theft, while Emma Goldman argued that wealth is simply another form of social power, the power, quote, to subdue, to crush, to exploit. She said that, like political power, it corrupts those who have it and it crushes those who do not. Capitalism, she said, dehumanizes workers, turning them into, quote, a mere particle of a machine. Capitalism was, she concluded, incompatible with human liberty. Collectivist anarchists also tend to support revolution as a means of achieving social change. They believe that parliamentary democracy is a sham and that the capitalist state cannot be simply taken over through elections, but rather must be destroyed altogether. Individualist anarchists, however, far from seeking to abolish the market, are more likely to seek to unleash it and free it from its current constraints. In other words, to give it even greater control than it already has within contemporary capitalism. Libertarian anarchists like Benjamin Tucker and Hosea Warren saw the market as the key mechanism by which people's individual and potentially conflicting interests could be brought into harmony with one another without the need for a state to do so. Anarcho-capitalists like Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard developed this argument still further, suggesting that all state functions, including even the criminal justice system, court, police, etc., would be provided by private companies rather than the state. Those who wanted access to those services could then take out a subscription to those companies to gain their protection, just like you take out a subscription to Netflix or whatever. Rothbard termed these protective associations. There'd be no state police force, for example, just competing private security companies. So clearly, this is a very different vision from those held by the collectivist anarchists, the anarcho-syndicalists like Bakunin and so on, who wanted the complete abolition of private companies, whereas Rothbard and Rand want private companies to run everything. So clearly, there are major differences between individualist and collectivist anarchists on this question of capitalism. That is an economic system based on private property, competition, and markets. Collectivist anarchists largely seek to abolish all those things altogether, whilst individualist anarchists largely seek to free them and even give them complete untrammeled power in society. And this is clearly a major difference. Yet, I would argue major differences over the economy are common in all ideologies. Take liberalism. Classical liberals and modern liberals, for example, also have completely opposite approaches to the role of the state in the economy. The minimal state of Locke's conception would view the enabling state promoted by T.H. Green as a brazen infringement of sacrosanct property rights. As such, under Locke's political philosophy, no less than armed revolution would be justified against the kind of enabling state that Green proposes. And yet liberalism is still considered a single ideology due to its focus on individual liberty, constitutionalism, and the rule of law. Likewise, it's hard to imagine a greater gulf than between, say, Karl Marx, who believed that private property should be abolished through revolution, and Anthony Giddens, who supported parliamentary democracy and free market capitalism. And yet both are considered socialists, and socialism is still considered a single ideology. So my argument is that differences on the question of economics alone, however great and even fundamental those differences are, is not a basis for ruling out anarchism as a single ideology. If this was the case, we'd have to say that liberalism is not an ideology, nor is socialism, or is even conservatism, because of the divisions between, for example, One Nation Tories and the New Right over the economy. So regardless of these differences over the economy and capitalism, then, anarchists remain united around the basic principle of voluntarism and the basic goal and vision of a stateless society. Of course, there are differences over the exact nature of the future stateless society, even within collectivist anarchism. Proudhon, for example, believed that some small private enterprise was justified if it were on a very small scale, and that only the larger enterprises should be collectively owned and controlled. But Bakunin and Kropotkin did not believe any private ownership of the means of production was acceptable. And whilst anarcho-syndicalists believed that trade unions would ultimately replace private companies and markets as the basic form of social and economic organization, Kropotkin believed that small self-sufficient communes should be the basic unit of production. But nevertheless, despite these differences of the exact forms of social organization in the future stateless society, the basic point remains that the fundamental vision of a stateless society, however it's organized, is one that ultimately unites all anarchists. Okay, so thirdly and finally, let's move on to part C of Andrew Heywood's third component of an ideology under Heywood's definition, the program, how you get from A to B, how you get from your analysis of the way the world is to your vision of how it should be, the program. So another way in which anarchists have differences is over their methods, their political program. In Heywood's terms, how to get from where we are now, their analysis of what is wrong with the world, to the future ideal, the stateless society. And here there are indeed major differences. To begin with, there are differences on the issue of whether violence is justified. In the late 19th century, anarchism was closely associated with violence. In this period, anarchists assassinated the Tsar of Russia, the King of Italy, the President of France, and the Empress of Austria. Bakunin's concept of propaganda by the deed advocated the assassination of leading state officials in order to rouse the masses to action, to prove that the ruling class were vulnerable and weak, and to provoke the state to react in a way that demonstrated both its cruelty and its impotence to the masses, by provoking it to lash out and reveal its true repressive nature. Anarchists such as Emma Goldman argued that the structural violence of capitalism imposed by the state, that is the violence of depriving people of their means of subsistence, condemning thousands every day to a slow death by starvation and poverty. Even today, by the way, 25,000 people starve to death each day under global capitalist rule. Goldman was believed that this structural violence was so outrageous and depraved that any means necessary were justified in overthrowing it. And she herself was involved with the attempted assassination of a factory owner whose strikebreakers had killed several of his striking workers. But this attitude towards violence was by no means shared by all anarchists. Proudhon, for example, considered violence abhorrent in principle. Anarchism, he believed, was what he termed order without power, whilst violence was a manifestation of power at its most extreme. Anarcho-pacifism became a major strand of the anarchist movement in the latter half of the 20th century, especially in the USA, strongly influenced by the non-violent civil disobedience promoted by Gandhi and Martin Luther King. This pacifist wing of anarchism believed violence was wrong in principle and corrupting in practice. It defied the fundamental anarchist principle of voluntarism, that no one should be forced to do anything against their will, as violence is inherently coercive. And violence has damaging effects on those who use it, blunting their natural human instincts to empathy and social solidarity. This was what Emma Goldman believed she had witnessed in the Soviet Union, which changed her beliefs about violence, which in her later years she argued could only be justified in self-defense. For some anarchists, violence was simply unnecessary, as there were other better ways of overthrowing the state. For the anarcho-syndicalists, the general strike was the weapon of choice, whilst Proudhon advocated what he termed dual power. Dual power involved the establishment of self-governing communities within the existing state structures, such as that the state itself would eventually simply become redundant. And followers of Gandhi and King, for example in the anarcho-pacifist Peace Pledge Union, believed that violence was politically unwise, as it muddied the waters between oppressor and oppressed. Strict adherence to non-violence, they believed, demonstrated the moral superiority of the resistance and the state as the true instigators of violence. And the issue of violence is not the only difference amongst anarchists over the means to achieve their goals. Some anarchists, defined as weak anarchists, as opposed to strong anarchists, do not even advocate the overthrow of the state at all. Max Stirner, for example, is in this camp. His antipathy to any moral commandments or obligations led him to believe that whilst no one has a moral duty to obey the state, no one has a duty to overthrow it either. For Stirner, if enough people began to follow the way of life he proposed, of egoism, whose only loyalty or moral duty was to themselves, then the state would simply collapse, as there would be no one left to act on its behalf. As we've seen, Proudhon had a similar outlook in terms of advocating a turn away from the state rather than a confrontation with it. So it's clear that anarchists are indeed divided over how to achieve their goals. But again, I would argue that this does not preclude seeing anarchism as a single ideology. Other ideologies, again, have their more militant and more pacifist wings, and none explicitly renounce violence in all circumstances. Locke, as we've seen, advocated armed revolution against states abusing human rights, a logic invoked recently, for example, by David Cameron in his bombing campaign against Libya in 2011. But other liberals have argued that force should never be used in international affairs, as people's innate rationality will always allow a peaceful settlement to be reached. Socialism has always had its Christian pacifist wing also, but that did not preclude Karl Marx's advocacy of armed revolution, nor did it preclude Tony Blair's war of aggression against Iraq. So again, we must hold anarchism to the same standards we use for other ideologies. If a single position on the use of violence is a prerequisite for defining an ideology, we would have to conclude there are no ideologies at all. Many social justice activists today, especially in direct action movements such as XR Youth or Palestine Action, are inspired by anarchism, and particularly by its emphasis on doing what is necessary oneself to combat injustice, regardless of the existing laws, rather than begging the state to address those injustices. And again, this can be seen as an approach common to all strands of anarchism. So in conclusion, yes, anarchism can be considered a single ideology for three reasons. Firstly, because there is in anarchism a shared analysis that the world's problems are caused primarily by the existence of states which unjustly restrict human freedom, crush the human spirit, and promote all kinds of negative behaviors amongst humans who, all anarchists broadly agree, are perfectly capable of exercising their own judgment and should have the complete freedom to do so. And again, that analysis is based again on a shared view of human nature as essentially rational, cooperative, and also flexible. Secondly, all anarchists share a vision of a stateless society. It's true that exactly what that society will look like in that stateless condition is subject to bitter disputes amongst anarchists, but that's true of all ideologies. Look at the differences between Locke and Green within liberalism, for example. Both would see the other's conception of the economic role of the state as a barbarous attack on human freedom. But both are liberals, Both practice human freedom. The same can be said about socialism, to look at the difference between the proposals of Anthony Giddens and Karl Marx. Yet both are considered socialists. Both are genuinely motivated by the aim of achieving a more equal society. Or look at the differences between a radical conservative like Hitler and a one-nation Tory like Harold Macmillan. Wildly different conceptions of the state, but both share a belief in the mystical importance of national traditions and property, and the basic aim of upholding national stability against, in particular, the threat of communism. In all these cases, there are wildly different visions of how society should operate, which nevertheless coexist within the broad camp of their respective ideologies. And finally, all anarchists share a basic program of challenging state power over our lives. For most anarchists, this means the abolition of the state, for example, Goldman, Bakunin, and Kropotkin. For others, it means simply ignoring the state's diktats and thus rendering it irrelevant, people like Stirner and Proudhon. Some support violence and some do not, but again, similar differences exist in all the other ideologies as well. So, although major differences exist within anarchism, differences over capitalism, over the nature of the future anarchist society, of the use of violence, nevertheless, anarchists all share a coherent set of fundamental beliefs, a faith in human nature, a skepticism towards hierarchies, a belief in the principle of voluntarism, and first and foremost, an antipathy to state power. And this agreement on basic elements of their analysis, vision, and program suggests that anarchism can indeed be considered a single ideology. Of course, perfectly possible to make an argument argue in the other direction. It really depends on what you consider most fundamental to an ideology. You could make an argument that actually the economic belief is the fundamental heart of what makes an ideology, and therefore the difference between anarcho-capitalists, for example, and anarcho-communists clearly would suggest that they're two different ideologies. You might argue that actually abolition of the state isn't really a goal of anarchism, but it's a means to an end. So it could be argued that, the point is, why do people want to abolish the state? They want to abolish it for completely opposite reasons in the case of individualist anarchists and collectivist anarchists. One set want to abolish it because they think that it's an impediment to total unrestrained free market capitalism. The other set want to abolish the state because they think it's imposing capitalism. So you might argue, well, actually the future is so wildly different between these two groups that the fact that they share a means to achieving that future of abolishing the state does not make it a single ideology. So that's just a few ideas of how you could argue and how an argument can be made in the other direction. Thanks for listening. Look, we've got a live question here. If we were to be asked about anarchism in an exam, do we need to give both views or disagree? Yeah, you need to give both views, as I have done in this lecture, but you need to show why you would agree with one side and disagree with the other. I think the key to this idea of evaluation within the kind of mark scheme that they use in A-level politics, the idea of evaluation is really showing what you actually believe and why, and making that clear at all times. So I hope in that lecture you saw how I presented the other side of the argument. I showed what the differences were, but I still maintain a consistent argument that this didn't mean anarchism was not a single ideology. So yes, you need to give both sides, but I would say at all times, try and make it clear why you agree with the side you do. So you see that in the lecture there, I presented my case, right? They've got a shared analysis on human nature, anti-clericalism, anti-state. I then showed how the argument could be made, but then I give a counter argument at the end each time. Yeah, so I said, okay, well, you could say, and there are these differences, and here are these differences, but that doesn't mean anarchism's not a single ideology, and here's why. So whenever you're giving a case that you disagree with, give the counter argument, right? And make it clear whether you agree with each argument or not, okay? So it's about acknowledging the other side, showing that there is another side, explaining what it is, but also showing whether or not you agree with it. Enjoyed this quite a bit, Miss G, thanks very much. But I do national, but hearing some stuff on anarchism was interesting. Yeah, good. I sometimes consider doing nationalism rather than anarchism. I used to like teaching fascism, but they took it off the curriculum when Michael Gove rejiggled the A levels. They removed the option to do fascism. I suppose Gove was probably looking through the stuff about fashion for, oh crikey, this sounds a bit too much like me. I don't think we should study that. Yeah, nationalism, Wolfie dude, interesting. Yeah, I have considered doing that. Very interesting. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed the video anyway. Thanks for watching. Any other questions from anyone? Okay, cool. All right. Thanks for watching, and yeah, maybe see you again. Thanks a lot.